Okay, very good. So who's afraid of the big bad wolf? Because every time I talk to interpreters, there seems to be an enormous fear out there, especially on the part of those who've never really come close enough to see what it is. So there you have him, the big bad wolf, an image of him at least, and it says, want to see what's inside? Come closer and I'll show you. And of course, it's so frightening from the, from our perspective, not knowing exactly what's inside, that we don't want to come close enough. But I'm here to dismiss some of your fears by going over the, how do I advance this? Going over the most important aspects that need to be in place for interpretation to happen. And once we look at that from the right perspective, you will notice that there is no real reason to be afraid. Now, in the story of Little Red Riding Hood, if you know anything about the story, you will notice that the story is a bit crooked, right? And you have, first off, an old lady living alone in the middle of the forest. Who in their right mind would leave somebody at that age living alone in the middle of the forest, right? And then you have someone who's probably a teenager or even maybe a child crossing that, whole expanse of land in the middle of the night or whatever. I mean, a very inhospitable place to go see her grandmother, who shouldn't be there in the first place. And the only character in the story that's really true to his true self is the wolf. And we call him Big Bad Wolf, but the wolf is not big or bad. It's just a wolf. It's the only character in the story that's doing exactly what they're supposed to do, what he is supposed to do, which is to act like a wolf. So if an opportunity presents itself, of course, the wolf is going to jump at it and it will go. However, in the story, when the little girl finally gets to the house where supposedly the old lady was, she finds someone that doesn't quite look like grandma in the bed. To a certain extent, then we now have a wolf that has incorporated some of the bad stuff we as humans do, which is the deception of trying to be who we're not, and so on and so forth. And inside, again, at that point, he's already eaten the grandma and so on. So that again adds a turn to the story that is just pretty much our imagination adding attributes to an animal, to a wolf, that deep down is nothing out of the ordinary if you think of it. So I'm here to actually show you what remote interpretation has to be if done properly. And I'm going to argue that if we do provide it with all the elements that we need to have in place, there is no need to fear. So let's advance. Now, it's not the first time that our profession is going to change, and it's not the first time that there is a lot of resistance to change, right? If we go back all the way to the Nuremberg trials in 1945, when simultaneous interpretation or conference interpreting the way we know it was being established, you will realize that the known interpreters of the time, the celebrity interpreters of the time, André Kamenker and others, were fiercely opposed to the new system. And they came up with all sorts of ideas as to why simultaneous interpretation was not to be even tried. At a point, somebody even mentioned that the speed would be so fast and the concentration required would be so fast that there was the risk of interpreters going mad and things of the sort. Eventually, whoever tried the system, again, they were coming out of a protracted war, and one of the interpreters to General Eisenhower decided to give it a try, but he wouldn't find any interpreter worth his salt available to try the system. So eventually he went to the University of Geneva and started talking to students who didn't know any better, and they wanted an opportunity. They wanted to get their foot in the door. And then by not knowing exactly what to expect, they were the ones who decided to give it a try, and it flew, and it worked. But now we take it for granted, and we think it's always been with us, but that's not true. Again, it's still a very recent story if you consider the longevity of the profession as a whole. We're talking about 70 years of profession, and in those 70 years, things haven't changed really much. Again, microphones became a bit more modern. The headsets now look different than the ones you see here. And of course, the booth, I mean, we went a long way making the booth really soundproof and a bit more adapted to our days. But deep down, we're using the same system that was introduced back in Nuremberg. So it was, again, I submit to you that it was about time that we introduced something new, okay? Now, then again, we're not really changing the setup that drastically, right? So if you look at this diagram, this could be a diagram of an in-person meeting with someone speaking from a podium, making a presentation with, computers in the room, projecting an image and microphones being used and video cameras, whatnot, taking it all, because these days we tend to stream meetings and so on. Interpreters sitting in their booths doing the magic, and people usually in the room, but they could also be elsewhere. So the difference now, the only thing that is totally new now is that not just the interpreters, but anybody in this picture could be anywhere. We now have the technology of making things work, even in situations where somebody misses a flight, where the interpreters cannot be sourced locally, or where you have now to reach out to people who are distributed over a large landscape. They are no longer just in front of you, which is not to say that you cannot use the same system to continue to cater to people who are in front of you, right? So in my new company, in my RSI company now that I founded about 3 years ago, KUDO, we have a hard time calling it remote interpretation because this, in a way, reduces it to something smaller than it really is. To the extent possible, we try to have the interpreters working side by side. We're going to talk about that. And if at all possible, we like to have the interpreters in the room. Now, if and only if you don't find one of those pieces in place, then you have the technology to continue to be able to meet and to circumvent problems that you would otherwise have. So what it means now is that we have a way to ensure business continuity. That's all it is. Our motto in KUDO is keep what works. As long as you have the budget, the installations, the human resources, the wherewithal to make something happen the way it should be, I'm the first one to suggest that we all gather in person. I would 10 times prefer to be in Boston with you, talking eye to eye and having the opportunity of gathering out at the hallways and having coffee and so on, because this is what makes us human. This is what makes the interaction sometimes much more profitable than just presenting the way I'm doing now, and then I close my microphone and my computer and I go to bed. So I miss out on a lot when I'm not present. But it's the next best thing, if you will. I mean, short of not being there for whatever reason, this allows you to at least have something going, which otherwise would have been impossible, right? So this is a picture of the way we do it in KUDO. It could be anything else. I'm not here to do propaganda for KUDO, but it's the system I know best. So basically what we're doing is we're allowing people to experience the beauty of interpretation with the new system, and in domains and niches, which up until here had been completely monolingual. So one fear that interpreters have when we talk about remote interpretation is that this is going to leave them without a job, that this is going to make them compete globally to a point that they will never be hired to do an in-person meeting again. And that is not so. So what we're trying to accomplish with a system like KUDO is to convince people who currently struggle in English or in Portuguese only, when not everyone speaks Portuguese or fluent Portuguese or English or French or whatever, by allowing them a system that now makes it affordable and easy enough for them to at least try interpretation. So if you looked at it from this angle, that we're actually expanding the horizon, we're actually expanding the market, part of the fear that you might otherwise harbor starts to melt away. Right? So basically in a meeting that you follow online, it's pretty much like being on Zoom, like we are now. It's pretty much like being on Skype or GoToMeeting or whatever, with the beauty that you now have a built-in button where you can choose the language. And you can also speak any language you want. So if you come here and you set your language to, say, Portuguese, which is my mother tongue, I can speak Portuguese, and anything anybody says will be either interpreted into Portuguese for me, or I will hear the flow in Portuguese automatically anyway. And that's very convenient for people who otherwise don't have enough fluency in a different language, okay? By the way, at any point, if you want to interrupt me with questions and so on, I don't mind. You can ask questions at any point in the presentation. Of course, at the end, we're going to save some time for questions anyway. Now, some of the things that we try to do, again, every time you're introducing a new technology, you have no choice but to come from the old technology, right? So I think it was Henry Ford who once said that it's very tricky to try and innovate, because if he had heard the client back then, because everybody was telling him, oh, you got to listen to your client. So, well, if I had listened to my client, I wouldn't have created an automobile. I would have created faster horses, right? Because this is all you knew. This is all you're accustomed to having. So, but in the beginning, there's no other way. We have to try and mimic what's out there. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. So we're trying to provide good image, good audio interpretation, of course, make it easy and so on, and also provide everything else that you find in a situation where you are present. So it is important that you are able to raise your hand and ask questions, that you can share documents, that you can make a presentation like I'm making now, and at a different point, Cristiana could make the presentation, voting, and so on and so forth. Only we're now pushing it all to the cloud and making it affordable at a distance. But basically, we're ensuring that every element that needs to be given in a situation, in a conference, is actually looked into and provided for the benefit and the comfort of everyone involved. Now, of course, you now have to bring into the mix the interpreters, right? So what I showed you before was whatever you see in KUDO as a participant. Now, the interpreter, of course, has a different setup. And once again, that setup tried to mimic what you would find if you came one day and walked into an interpretation booth to work as an interpreter, right? The only difference, of course, is that you don't have people in front of you, so you need some sort of video input to show you what's happening somewhere else. But other than that, everything else you see on the interface is something you would expect to find in a normal console. So you have an outgoing channel box here where you can select the outgoing channels. You can pre-configure up to 3 and then select. You have full control of your microphone. You can mute your microphone. You can enable it or disable it. You can go from the floor or from a different channel. You have an audio meter here to indicate where the sound is coming into the system for you. You have a volume control. Basically, you can now go into up to 3 languages that you pre-configure at any point in time. You can go both ways. You can do whatever you need to do. And you can take full relay. Also, on this corner here, we make it possible for you to see not just the video, but also any presentations anybody is making. And if you make a presentation, it's akin to my presenting now, where you have a thumbnail of the person speaking, plus the slides. On top of it, we have a few more features that are not even present when you are in an in-person situation. We're going to cover that. So the idea, again, was to mimic what's out there, try to be as conservative as possible while being disruptive, right? By the very nature, this is a disruptive technology that pushes the interpreter away if needed, but allows him to feel as if he or she is in the room, right? But even the color coding, the microphone that's red when it's on and green when it's off, which for some people is a bit counterintuitive, this is all following the ISO standards, quite interestingly. Now, where it starts to get a bit complicated is that as soon as the landscape is occupied by a number of solutions and a number of people who don't necessarily have a background in interpreting, you start to see deviations from the norm, and you start to see creative use of technology in ways that are detrimental to the profession. This is not the case in our company because it's a solution that has an interpreter behind. And again, a solution that's coming from an established tradition of in-person meetings. But the moment you tell an interpreter that now you have this technology and you can now work from anywhere, they take it to heart. And before you know, they want to work in a situation like this from a hotel room, or they try to work from home, and at a point in time, the dog's going to start barking, the neighbors are going to start fighting, maybe there's a contractor coming that you didn't know about, and they cut the electricity in your building without prior notice. And this is all something that may and will affect the quality of your meetings. So to circumvent that, and because we understand also that interpreting is teamwork, and interpreter is something that interpreters want to approach from the point of view of just being linguists rather than techies and technicians, we came up with the idea of doing what we call making or building what we call KUDO Studios. So think of it as a hub where you set up 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 booths somewhere, physical installations, and you come and prepare everything. So if I'm an interpreter and I go to a studio, I will find it's akin to walking into a booth and seeing the consoles there. I'm going to have a station already prepared for me with the right headset, another monitor for documents, and so on. And on the side, the same setup for a colleague. In front of me, there's a chair for a technician, and there will be a technician standing by. So it's business as usual. I walk in, I sit down, I have a colleague by my side, I can exchange notes. The only difference is that we are not in the room. As long as the connectivity is strong, and by the way, we have redundant internet provision, we have an APS to sustain the power in case power is cut. So everything that we can control has been controlled. And the way we go about doing it, because KUDO doesn't want to become another LSP, is we just partner with other companies and even interpreters who have their clients and want to provide that solution so that they become the studio owners and they run with it. So currently we have studios in, I guess, 14 cities. We have added Goiânia in Brazil. We have added Cambridge in the UK. We're in the process of expanding out to Asia. So this is catching and this is becoming the norm. Now you do have other providers out there who insist on having interpreters work from home. We don't necessarily see that as a sin, because if your client is happy with you and knows you, and the setting is forgiving enough in case the dog barks, it's all okay. They know what they're paying for, and it might be just 20 minutes of a meeting, an hour-long meeting, and so on, and they know what they're buying. And that's okay. We're not here to impose that unless you come to a studio, you cannot have it done. It can be done. It's just that it starts to verge on the unprofessional, depending on what the expectations are, okay? Now, one thing to keep in mind is that remote interpretation doesn't change anything as far as the need to have good interpreters, right? There's a slide where I summarize this down the road, but eventually it's not an excuse or some sort of a screen behind which you can hide and give it a try and try your hand at simultaneous interpreting when you haven't really done it before in real life, right? These platforms are there for real seasoned conference interpreters. You have to be an interpreter in the first place. You have to have the training. You have to have the experience. It's not for beginners, right? But you do need to be trained on what to do. So in KUDO, for example, that is accomplished, I'm sorry, very easily online. Again, we have prepared a tutorial online that takes about an hour and a half to complete. So any interpreter with the credentials, with the experience, who wants to become KUDO certified, as we say, can take a course in a matter of 1 hour and a half, and then come back for an online test drive, a real life situation where they get to interpret with a lot of other colleagues for about an hour. And with that, they know where to click, they know what to have, they know what kind of setup they need to have, what kind of gear and so on, and they're good to go, right? So there is some specificity to it, but deep down, this is interpreting as we've always known it, right? Now, of course, you're not dealing with a hardware console, so there will be differences, right? You don't have a piece of hardware in front of you necessarily, although you can have. So you're controlling it in different ways. So you have, of course, first the mouse. You can touch the different buttons on the screen with your mouse. And if you have a touch screen computer like I do, you can touch it with your hands. And then it becomes pretty much like a console, depending on how you look at it. You can also use your keyboard. And we do provide some shortcut keys in case you don't want to have your hands off your keyboard. Sometimes, you're using the other monitor to do searches and, prepare glossaries and whatnot. So it's good to have also some shortcut keys to, enable your microphone, disable your microphone. You come in and you configure everything. But again, everything that we could do to make the lives of interpreters easier has been done, at least in our platform, right? And if you're really old school and you wouldn't prefer to have something like a hardware, if you feel more comfortable having something, a piece of hardware to touch, we can tell you what to get. This is not a KUDO piece, but this is something you buy online, and we help you program it in such a way that you now have a little piece that you can connect to your computer as a USB. You configure your platform, and then from that point on, you can touch it with your fingers. You could go to the floor or you take relay. So there are 6 basic functions that you can do here. Plus you have a big volume button that you can touch with your hands. It's sturdy, nice to touch. So some people prefer to have it done. I can send you a copy of this presentation later, Cristiano, for you to distribute to our colleagues. And those links will give you more information about it. Right? Now, this is, again, trying to summarize pretty much all the aspects of what I've covered. My attempt here is to show you that as long as you look at it from the right angle, there's no reason to fear. Now, you need to have those tenets in place if you're really serious about interpreting and if you want to make it advance in a professional way, right? First off, the motto in KUDO, right? You keep what works. I mean, KUDO is not out to replace anybody or anything. We're here to, accommodate the corner cases that currently cannot be solved with normal equipment or with people gathered in the room. So if somebody misses a flight, or if somebody falls ill, or if you can't find interpreters in a given location, or if you need to combine, you do find 3 interpreters, but you don't find the other 2. You can now resort to a solution like ours. Also, interpreters are at the heart of our success. The seed of what we have now in KUDO and the other RSI platforms started back at the UN and the organization where I was working, where they wanted to have delegates participate in meetings without coming to Geneva. You have people in Burkina Faso and Ghana and so on who don't necessarily have the means to come to Geneva 7-8 times a year for meetings that are very important for their regions. So there was a lot of pressure to develop what they called back then electronic methods of meetings. Funny way of saying it, but that's how they called it. So the idea was to, again, keep the meeting, the physical meeting going with interpreters in the room, everybody else there, but allowing delegates to participate remotely. So we called it remote participation at some point. In that process, I not only interviewed the interpreters, but I gave them a voice. So every time we tried a pilot, we had a briefing with the interpreters and then a debriefing with the interpreters, and a lot of effort had to be done to actually protect their reputations. Because deep down, what interpreters are concerned about and worried about is their reputation. It's the only thing they have. It's it's the thing on which their ability to find more work is contingent. So I'm only as strong as an interpreter as my last performance. So you don't want to be interpreting remotely and then all of a sudden there's a glitch in the sound and people refer to you as a bad interpreter as a result of that. So we wanted to have interpreters feel protected, and we went out of our way to actually introducing in the system all the disclaimers, everything else that the interpreters needed to have in place in order to feel confident and move ahead. Another important aspect are working conditions, right? We don't want to introduce a solution in the market that helps deteriorate the working conditions that the profession fought so hard to establish, like, for example, teamwork. We don't want to be the proponents of a system that forces interpreters to work alone. We want you to look at it from a different angle, that on occasion you might be sharing the booth with a colleague who is not physically present with you, but we do insist on having 2 interpreters per language. We do insist on having interpreters work side by side whenever possible. And we do enforce things like workload, manning strength, all this. And again, we take the lead of AIC in that regard, and other such instruments out there, agreements with organizations that are already in place, and that again result from years and years of negotiations with interpreters. You don't want to undermine that. Another misconception is money, right? Every interpreter I've spoken with has at least some degree of fear that by going to work remotely, they're going to be subject to, charging per minute or charging per hour, or being forced to work alone and so on. But particularly on the rate, they fear that there might be some downward pressure on the rate. I don't want to sugarcoat it. Of course, there will be downward pressure on the rates from the sole fact that you're now competing globally. If I have to schedule an event and staff an event with Portuguese interpreters tomorrow, and my client asks me for a referral, I will refer all the interpreters I know, but it will be in their interest to hire, for example, somebody in Brazil who has top-notch Portuguese for a fraction of the cost that they would pay in the US. This is not KUDO imposing it. It's just opening the door so that clients now can go talk to interpreters in Brazil and pay the going rate there. Now, there are imbalances because of regions and so on, and the system allows you to take advantage of that. But nobody is imposing that from now on to work remotely, you need to charge per minute, or you need to accept to be paid per hour. Some interpreters do work remotely, but they have established that, no, I can make a concession and offer you a half-day rate, even if it's just for 1 hour or 20 minutes. And then after, say, 1 hour, it's a full day's rate. So it depends on the amount of work you have elsewhere. It depends on what the conditions are in your particular corner of the woods, right? But nobody is imposing those things on you. Teamwork, I've covered that. I don't have to talk about that. And the fact that KUDO is not for beginners. Again, you don't want to hide behind a screen and pretend that you are an interpreter when you're not. And the whole notion of continuous feedback, that conversation with interpreters here, that continues to this date. We continue to brief and debrief after every event, and we continue to advance and make the interface better at every iteration of our product. We just introduced now, for example, a new button for the handover, because in the past it was kind of awkward. You had to chat with a person, and it's very distracting when you're interpreting to stop and go to a chat and say, okay, ready when you are, and things like that. So you now have a button where you can click when you're ready to switch. The person is notified, she clicks and notifies you back, you hear a beep, and then you have a countdown. When you find the perfect moment, you just click on it again and it's sent over to your colleague. So it's very seamless. It's pretty much like being in the booth and looking over, nodding your head and getting ready for the switch. And finally, we don't want to push interpreters out of the picture, particularly KUDO does not. So we are relying on interpreters to go out there and shake those shoes. We don't want to become another LSP. We don't want to compete by having a huge roster of interpreters that we impose and manage from for the benefit of our clients. No, we want to become and be just the technology provider. If you are an interpreter and you have clients and you see an opportunity where you could be servicing meetings beyond your geography, we'd be happy to talk to you. We have a full program to empower you as a partner so you can continue to do what you do, and we will have your back. We will offer you the necessary discounts and advantages so that you can capitalize on it and make it work for you. So as long as you have all these things in place, this, of course, will change interpretation. It will be the end of interpreting as we know it to a certain extent, but it will never be the end of interpreting. The UN is not going to replace the system they have with exclusively this system. By the way, the company KUDO is part of a business group that has another two companies. One sells equipment to the UN. Every piece of equipment you find in the UN has been sold by us, a company called Media Vision, and also leases equipment. So if you go to a G20 meeting or an annual meeting of the IMF, anytime you have a large gathering outside of somebody's premises and you need to rent out equipment, our company, Conference Rental, does exactly that. So we're not out to shoot ourselves on the foot. Again, we're just trying to deal with the corner cases that would allow us to use that technology in such a way as to keep in place what works, give interpreters more work, and expand the horizons rather than shrink it. Now, the typical use cases, just to, again, give you an idea of the types of situations where having equipment doesn't really matter. Again, things we've done in the past. So we've done the World Polio Day for Rotary International. Now, here's a situation of an international organization that has its own team of interpreters in Chicago. They have booths, they have equipment, they have everything. But they have this event once a year, every 24th of October, where they stop to take stock of everything they're doing as far as the fight against polio, and to celebrate also the wins. Now, usually they gather in a city. This year it was in Philadelphia. They make a presentation to about 300 people in the audience, and those people are getting interpretation done for them remotely. Again, in the auditorium, it's all in English, but from there it's being streamed to Rotary members all over the world now, using the same body of interpreters that they rely on for their physical meetings anyway. So it now goes all over the place. So you would never reach somebody in Japan, Brazil, Norway and whatnot, if it weren't for a system like this. You can also use it to take interpreters to places where it's not safe to physically send them there. For example, let's say an earthquake just hit, God forbid, Haiti again, and you want to assess what the situation is. You don't want to send interpreters there, or if it's a conflict zone. Now, with as little as a computer and a webcam and some connectivity, ordinary connectivity, you can get a meeting going and have good professional language support in place without improvisations. Right? Again, something you couldn't do otherwise. Remote participation, I've told you about. Decentralized meetings is what we're doing here now, where everybody connects from where they are. And underserved locations is the notion that if I were to promote an event today in Odessa, Ukraine, where I want Russian, Ukrainian, and English covered, that's easy to do locally. But the minute I want to introduce, say, Portuguese, I bet you won't find a Portuguese interpreter in Kiev or Odessa or anywhere near the venue. So you could have some interpreters locally, and you can use a technology like this to, again, give work to an interpreter who would otherwise be sitting in Brazil idly, not doing much. Now that person can be servicing a meeting half a world across. So I will stop here. I'm, again, happy to answer any questions that you might have. I hope to have given you a good enough overview of the possibilities and the situations and how companies who know what they're doing at least approach the business of remote interpretation. I will leave you with those details in case you want to give it a try with KUDO. If you have the credentials and if you have what it takes and would like to give it a try, you can try it at your pace, at your leisure. Give it a try, go slow and see if it's for you. It is not for everyone. Some people just don't want to be bothered with other technology. They have enough work in the brick and mortar world out there. But if you're not one of those, and if you're intrigued by the technology and so on, this is the future. This is the reason why I left the UN with a full pension and a permanent contract to come try my hand at this. If we want to leave a mark in the profession, this is where the technology is going. This is getting better and better by the day. And in no time, this will not become the norm, but it will be one of the staples that you can point to when considering the different possibilities that you have at your disposal to actually hold a meeting. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll stop here and ready to take any questions.